I'm going in the interest of time to get started with some housekeeping and announcements that will give time for more people to arrive and to join us. And they'll miss my talking, but they won't miss any of your talking, I hope. But that way we will start on time and get people also out of here on time. You will all have already gotten the notification that we're recording so that we can share this both now and in the future. And capture the remarks, so you'll be asked your permission to record, of course. For those who haven't met me, my name is Beth Novak. I'm a professor at Northeastern University and director of the Burns Center for Social Change and the GovLab. Some of you may have joined us previously in the former incarnation of this lecture series, which was known as the Future of Democracy lecture series, aptly named when we used to be at NYU. And I'm very delighted that after a small hiatus, we've been able to restart this series, and today is our first presentation. For those who don't know the Burns Center, we work, not surprisingly, on ways in which we can design and implement practical solutions to society's hardest problems. The way that we do that work is very much involving use of technology and use of citizen engagement and participation, and now increasingly with AI. So this lecture series fits very well with what we do and to helping us to rethink and reimagine what democracy will look like in the AI age. And it's very appropriate in some ways that today, with the announcements from Google about the new features for Bard, from Microsoft about the imminent launch of Copilot, from OpenAI about the new DALL-E 3, which is quite worth taking a look at. It's a really exciting day to be starting this because I think we are at the midst, obviously, of a transformative moment in our history and the unleashing of one of the most important technologies that will now increasingly be at the desktop and at our fingertips for all of us of our age. But what has been missing in all of this hype about different products and all of the doomsaying about the ways in which the robot apocalypse will soon be upon us, or the singularity, or the death of humanity due to AI, what we're missing is a more sober conversation about the ways in which AI could impact institutions, and above all, could impact our democratic institutions, and help us potentially to realize a participatory democratic future of the kind that Josh and Brook have written about, not only in their current book, but so eloquently in past books. So I'm delighted to have you here to kick off this series. I'm sure you need no introduction, but for those of you who don't know, I'm going to put their bios in the chat. Brook is an independent consultant who writes frequently about politics, democracy, technology, and business. He's the author of The Origin of Citizenship in Ancient Athens, another Princeton book, and A Company of Citizens. What's the World's First Democracy teaches leaders about creating great organizations, which of course he wrote with Josh, our other speaker here today. Josh is the Constantine Mitsotakis Professor of Philosophy at Stanford University in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's the author of other books besides The Rise and Fall of Classical Greece, Democracy and Knowledge, Innovation and Learning in Classical Athens, again, more Princeton books, and The Greeks and the Rational, The Discovery of Practical Reason, as well as many other titles. And so we're delighted to bring them here to you today, together with our colleagues from the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern and my colleagues at the GovLab, and to celebrate the publication of this new book. So before we even dive in and get started, let's make sure to put the link to that book in the chat so that as they're talking, you can go ahead and order it. I'm allowed to put in that plug, even if you're not. And for being here, you get so generously from Princeton and from our authors a 30% discount on the book. So I put that code in the chat, and we'll share that throughout the lecture and afterwards so that you can go ahead and get the book for yourself, because unfortunately we will not have enough time today to cover all the exciting topics that we have here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and dive in and just let people know that to start thinking about your questions, because we will save plenty of time at the end for conversation from you. But I will exercise moderator's privilege to get us started with some questions. And I'm really excited for us to be able to do this. It is not coincidental, although the publication date is coincidental, it is not coincidental that we're having this conversation about the future of democracy and what AI means for democracy by focusing on a book that very squarely focuses on the past and very squarely focuses on the history of democracy, as I think we're going to make clear. In order to dive into that conversation, though, it will really help, I think, everybody here if we start with some definitions. And by asking you and interrogating you a little bit at its most basic on what you mean by democracy. You use the definition in the book very simply of the idea of having no boss. It's really simple, it's very straightforward, but I'm hoping you can expand on it a little bit. And maybe I'll start with you, Josh, and just share with us how you've come to this understanding of democracy, what democracy means to you, and then we'll go forward from there to interrogate what it means in the future technological era.
Great. Thanks very much, Beth. Delighted to be here and having this conversation with all of you today. So the goal that we had in defining democracy was to be as basic as possible, to strip away as much of the superstructure as we could. When we looked at historical cases, what we found is that no boss, that is the rejection of having somebody in authority over all of us, or some gang, some junta that runs things, rather than the rest of us, was the common denominator of self-government. So if we think of democracy as self-government, it means that we, the people, the citizens, are the rulers. And it means, therefore, that we reject any ruler but ourselves. So there's lots of other things that we might desire from democracy, but if we don't start with ruling ourselves, being our own boss, and therefore rejecting any other boss but ourselves, we've, I think, missed the real core element of what democracy is. After all, the original Greek term, demos, the people, kratos, ruling or power, it is really ruling ourselves, the demos, we the people ruling ourselves, that is for us at the core of this thing that we care about, democracy.
Brooke, anything you want to add to that?
I do. I think the simplicity of the definition is really critical, but even more critical was the boldness, I think, on our part to actually try to define democracy. One of the problems when you talk about saving democracy or getting rid of democracy or amending democracy is it's not always clear in anybody's mind.
You sent that document?
What's
perfect? Great. Thank you so much for your help.
Sorry, we'll mute. Go ahead, John. Go ahead.
So, I mean, the bridge to the AI conversation is, just to use a bit of jargon, I'm sure you all know the alignment problem. I mean, what is it? What is the thing that we are either trying to save, trying to replace, trying to make better? And depending on how you define democracy, you may come up with some very different answers. And those different answers may be very impactful in training the AI neural nets. So I think the definition is absolutely critical. And again, we can debate whether or not we came up with the right one, but it is, I think, a necessary starting point for any kind of conversation like this.
So this definition for you really emerged from studying these historical cases, and anyone who's read your past books, and I'm a huge fan and have been enormously inspired and owe you a debt of gratitude for your, as we all do, for your writing about ancient Athens. But in this case, you've moved us forward in history and talked about Rome and Britain, as well as the United States. So would just love to hear a little bit about the insights from those cases. I think it's helpful, again, even though we want to get into talking about the future, of what the learnings are from those past cases and how they inform this definition.
Well, the big learning which crept into the title of the book is that you can, armed with the definition that we're using, you can start to see that democracy is fundamentally a bargain amongst the people who want to govern themselves as citizens. And once you get to that point, then you start to think about, well, where do bargains come from? And why do bargains take place? And why does bargain make a difference when you're thinking about democracy? And in each of our cases, I think there's a couple of trends that I think are worth understanding as we look ahead. One is that democracy did not come out of nowhere. I mean, the comic book version of democracy is there's some kind of a revolution and then everybody is free and we're off to the races. The reality is that democracy, certainly in the famous cases we looked at, developed slowly over a long time through usually incremental sharing of power, distribution of rights in exchange for support for a king or support for an oligarch. And those incremental political bargains, as we call it, were fundamental in building the platform, the conceptual platform, that in order to govern yourself, you've got to essentially make some kind of a deal about how you're going to work together and live together if you don't have a boss. And so whether we're talking about the aristocrats that were thrown out in Athens, the kings and oligarchs who had to give way to the plebeians and the broader populace in Rome, the rise of the parliament against a king, and of course, the formation of our post-revolutionary constitution. There was always a process of prior bargain making and sharing or making compromise to bring more people into the government, to make more people citizens, and that it stayed as an integral part of democracy, because the democracy, once the king is gone, requires further bargaining, people making adjustments, making compromises to put in place the institutions, to put in place the norms, to put in place the notions of how are we going to keep this going, which is what we talk about under the rubric of civic education. So I think those are sort of the cross-cutting and the meta-learning from the cases.
Josh, anything that you want to add before I want to interrogate this concept of compromise?
Yeah, I just want to say that it really was by comparing cases, by using this case study method and looking both at what was similar and what was different, that we generated this sort of core idea that the thing that each of these shared was a history of bargain making, tough bargains, bargains in which neither side, or however many sides there were, got all that they wanted. And yet both sides were better off, everyone was better off inside the bargain than they were outside the bargain. And it's the recognition of that bargain making, in fact, is something that makes us all better off, even though none of us gets everything that we want, is really the key to democratic success. It's the rejection of the idea that the way that we do politics ought to be zero sum. That is, winner take all and loser goes home crying. Rather, it is a matter of each of us getting more than we could get if we didn't enter into a good faith negotiation with one another and a continuing negotiation with one another.
And on the other end of the spectrum, democracy is not about consensus. And, even in Norway and Denmark, people disagree. I mean, people often say, oh, we need a homogeneous culture. Well, people tend to disagree. And so you're not going to get consensus, and the bargain becomes the linchpin for making it work.
Unmute. So tell this to Kevin McCarthy. I'm very curious about this focus on consensus in light of the moment where we are today. It seems a very difficult time for us to get back to constructive bargaining. And if you read, How Democracies Die, the kind of magisterial work by Levitsky and Ziblatt, they place a lot of emphasis about the fact that, one side paints the other as the enemy, not just in the United States, but in other places where democracy is perhaps even more on the brink. So I'm curious about your sort of self-professed optimism here, and how you see us as being able to get back to constructive bargaining. especially if this is the essential ingredient for democracy? How do we begin to see one another as partners rather than just as enemies in an era of extreme partisanship?
I think one thing to think about, this is one of the advantages of doing it historically, is that democracies always have histories that are extremely difficult, that go through periods of real crisis, periods in which it appears that the society has just simply come apart. So to suppose that democracy is supposed to be just smooth sailing, that we're all supposed to be happy with one another all the time, is simply to make a hash of the actual history of any real democracy. And the question is now are we at a moment in which this thing is going to end? Because of course, the case studies that we looked at were long-lasting democracies, ones that had in fact survived. That's our point, is that there's ways in which democracies do survive and get through their periods of crisis. I think to leap to the assumption that because we have a lot of childish behavior and non-cooperative behavior in our current Congress and in our current politics, that this is the end, is premature. If we simply assume that, then we better get ready to get into the bunker and get ready for the fight. And I mean a serious, real fight, physical fights. So maintaining a certain level of optimism, I think, gives us the reason to say that we better think about what it would take to get us back to the position of being able to being in a room together and coming to some kind of a negotiated solution. So optimism is always for us, I think, very guarded. We're not Pollyanna-ish in any sense. But on the other hand, we think that there's it's almost self-destructive to leap to the assumption that everything is already so far gone that the end is inevitable.
You know, one of the things I think we are trying to do with this book is quite simple and probably obvious to everybody on this call, but it's not obvious to many citizens today, and particularly young people who have not had as much of the right kind of civic education as probably we think they should. And that is that democracy is imperfect. I mean, it's a human construct. It's made up of people who just will never completely agree with one another. And that democracy is not about amassing as much power, money, and supporters as possible to completely shut down those with whom you disagree. I mean, that isn't democracy at its best. It's not even democracy. But I think many people, they don't understand that. I mean, the media today thrives on conflict and antagonism. And I think many people just plain lost sight of the fact, which again, history helps you understand, that it's not a religious war. I mean, there's this famous phrase, you know, democracy is not a suicide pact. Well, it's also not a religious war. The goal is not to eliminate all Catholics because you're Protestant or vice versa. And I just think that's forgotten. So in terms of getting back, I think it starts with, let's understand what it is we're actually trying to save and what makes it work.
We have a lot to discuss here, but you began to allude to the idea of the role of civic education. So I'm going to put a pin in that for 1 second. And I want to just push a little more on some of the forces that are causing this kinds of fracture, especially because this is a conversation about technology. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the role of technology in impeding, and we'll talk more in a minute about helping to repair this civic bargain and this friendship. So, you know, in her Atlantic piece last year, Anne Applebaum referred to social media as democracy's dumpster fire. So I'm really curious sort of how you view the role of democracy, the role of technology in this case, not democracy, as strengthening or undermining the civic friendship that you're calling for. And I don't know if there are any historical examples to draw on here that might be helpful with, but how do you see today the role of social media in essentially enabling or disabling what you are hoping to call for?
I think at least one way to think about it is that democracy has typically been built on the back of big breakthroughs in communication technology. You think about in Athens, Athenian democracy comes after the basically the alphabetic revolution, the use of an alphabet instead of a syllabary form of writing, and therefore the possibility that many more people can become literate. If we look forward to the English and the American developments of democracy, it comes on the back of movable type, of print media. So it's not inevitable that communication technology is destructive of democracy. In fact, it potentially allows many more people to be engaged in the conversation that ultimately is the underpinning of ruling ourselves. The question now is, is the media, is technology today just radically different, such as that it inevitably rips us apart rather than allows us to communicate more effectively? Well, there certainly are a lot of sort of disaster scenarios out there. Although very recently, some of my colleagues at Stanford, in combination, co-authoring with people from other universities, have done a really very large end study of Facebook, and their conclusion is that at least the Facebook communities are not doing much to actually change things one way and another. That's why I think we have
I do think we have a Zoom bomber. Yes, we'll pay attention here. We will evict that person. Thank you.
Thank you. At any rate, the conclusion of these recent series of studies, experiments that were run in a very well-controlled manner, is that people are not changing their political attitudes nor their behavior because of their engagement on online communities. That is probably much more influential has been cable TV and the polarization that we see in cable TV. So I think I don't want to rush to the judgment that everything about contemporary social media is particularly is the dumpster fire. I think that at least before we make that assumption, we better make sure that the evidence actually supports that.
I think, Beth, there is also, looking back at history, again, the truism that we have to face with the asterisk about AI being potentially qualitatively different than technology, because we're talking about technology in a very broad-based structure. But through history, the written word, the printing press.
I'm sorry, we're gonna, I would just ask the folks who are helping to moderate the chat here to please, we're gonna disable screen sharing, please. Thanks, go ahead.
So the printing press, caused some of the great bloody religious wars of the 17th and 18th century. But it also, circulated the ideas of John Locke, which helped produce ultimately American democracy. I mean, social media has a lot of evil actors. We're enjoying one in this webinar, but it also produces a lot of good. People can exchange ideas. They can find networks of like-minded people, many of whom are well-intended for political change and transformation. So again, it's the old question of it's sort of more of a tool and depends on who's swinging it than in itself being to blame. Now, the question which I think this webinar tees up is, okay, but do we have with generative AI something that is actually qualitatively different, where it is out of our reach at a certain point, and will it be ultimately destructive? But no matter what, the development of it right now is drawing upon human knowledge. And I think one of the most important issues about civic education is what kind of messages about civic education are we going to be training our AI machine learning with now? I mean, we can turn it into something pretty negative and pretty awful if you happen to hate democracy, like some people do. It can also be tremendously empowering, but it will take a life unto its own. But we are in the formative stage. I was listening to a panel discussion say the way to think about generative AI is like right now it's like raising children. You are helping them to have certain values and have certain ideas about the future. At some point, they will go on and be their own adults and maybe do some pretty bad and silly things, even awful things. But you give it your best shot at the front end. And I think that's what we have to think about right now in terms of civic education and democracy.
So I think it might help. This is a great segue. I have to say the Zoom bombing is so early 2020. I haven't had that in 3 years. So I'm almost nostalgic for some Zoom bombing, and it came at a very appropriate moment in the questioning. But it was very intentional to start with social media, because we do have to, as you're taking us forward into asking about what the implications are for AI. In order to do that, I think talking for a moment about this concept of civic education is crucial in sort of defining that. And you talk in the book about civic education as fostering an ethical mindset and a set of pragmatic skills. And I'm hoping you can just connect this concept in your prescription for civic education back to your definition of democracy as life without a boss, to just use a shorthand. If you could just explain to us this concept of civic education and what you mean by it in terms of playing a role for democracy, sort of very concretely. Are there examples that you've seen that excite you? Are there things that you're working on? What does that look like to you in your imagining? And then I want to ask you, and you can go straight there, is what does AI mean for reinvigorating civic education?
Well, one of the things that we found in each of our cases is that successful democracies, and democracies not only that maintain steady states and do well over time, but also that survive crises, have robust forms of educating citizens. So citizens need a certain kind of knowledge. They need to have a knowledge of how their system works, of the institutions that they themselves have created and that sustain. They have to have a background understanding of the conditions that sustain the possibility of those institutions actually working. And the sort of 7 basic conditions for democracy to survive is really at the core of our book. We lay these out in some detail, but they all really come around to the potential to be an effective negotiator, an effective member of the group that is around the table, always in some sense a virtual table, who are working out the conditions, the agreement that is going to allow them to share their lives together. So that has been different in terms of its form, if we look historically. But I think today we can say that the basics of civic education have to be about how do institutions work, what are the skills in terms of the communication skills that you need to have for that, what's the kind of experience of actually being a citizen, doing citizenship that you need to be effective across the period of your life. We at Stanford have been trying to get this going. There's now a course that was this year taken by about 1,100 freshman first-year students, and we hope in the next 2 years will be taken by all first-year Stanford students, called Citizenship in the 21st Century, in which we lay out what we think are some of the basic knowledge, some of the basic skills that are in our view, necessary for citizens to be really effective in this business of self-government. So part of it, frankly, is an exemplification of the things that Brook and I wrote in the book. The book was in some ways meant to be not the textbook that we're going to use, but at least to lay out what we think is essential for citizens to understand about what is necessary for them to know, to be able to do in order to be able to, with others, govern themselves.
Yeah, I think also we have to include, obviously, history. Where did democracy come from? Which again we tried to sketch out in our version of the story in the case studies. Why did it matter? And again, our definition of freedom, life without a boss, except one another, is kind of our shorthand. But I think that civic education in the recent past was kind of value free, or else it got so freighted with a particular interpretation that is now part of the battleground of our culture wars. So was America fundamentally bad, born in slavery, or was America the shining ideal on the hill with no problems whatsoever? I think most people are acknowledging today we need some kind of, acknowledgement of past mistakes, but desires to make things better, and to read history in that light. There's going to have to be a lot of experimentation about what that looks like in actual curricula and that kind of thing. But we think this notion of focusing on liberty and the contrast with what it means to live under rulers or autocrats that do not honor liberty, that punish individual rights and behavior, and particularly the kind of threats that we're facing if we don't defend some version of democracy based on liberty and equality. So I think we do have to get back to some kind of content that is affirmative of democracy as part of what civic education is.
So yeah, and I think one way to sort of sum up what Brook is saying is that citizens have to recognize that there are really profound costs to giving up what they have. That there is a positive value to self-government, but in order to gain that value, they've got to pay some costs in order to avoid paying the pretty terrible costs of life under an autocrat.
So just a quick point of order. We're going to move soon to Q&A. I'm going to reserve moderator's privilege to really ask you now squarely about AI, which I want to do. But we're going to ask for questions in the chat. Doing it that way allows us then to have a tight finish so that we can share this later on the web. And then after 6 o'clock, people can then also raise their hand and ask questions if Brook and Josh are willing to stay on a little more, which I think they are. But for the time being, if you have questions, which I see many already coming in, if you would put them in the chat, that would be wonderful. And now let me come back to both of you and really talk about the role that AI could play in improving civic education and what you envision here. So I'm also excited, as Leah puts in the chat, about the potential for this curriculum, which, knowing Stanford, will be heavily about technology, and I would love to talk more about that course. But what you see as being the potential here for generative AI as a positive or a negative. And just a quick reminder that this lecture series is very much about imagining the future we want to create. So we'd love to hear about what we should be doing, given that we've heard enough from Elon Musk about what we shouldn't be doing.
I think one of the things that I imagine as a positive future for AI is that if AI is correctly educated, I think Brook is exactly right. It's like it has to be brought up like a child. We imagine that we have an AI that is brought up to be a loyal democratic AI. in that case, we could imagine then AI being or taking the role, and I think the absolutely essential role of, or at least part of the essential role of expertise and expert testimony in democracy. Because democracy actually has to have experts. When we say we govern ourselves, we're going to have to govern ourselves, we the people, by reference to a understanding about a lot of very complex technical things. We need expert testimony that will allow us to make the right kind of judgments, the right kind of policies. This is true in Athens, it was true in Rome, it's true in the UK, in early US. It's never not been true. The big problem about expertise in a democracy is the experts may just end up taking over. So one of the big tensions in every democracy is, are the experts who are giving us advice actually loyal members of our democratic community? Do they have the self-government of the people firmly in their value system? Presumably, if AI could be trained to do that, it could then bring to us the kind of, and to each of us, to each individual, an explanation of the various sort of technical questions that we need to make the right kind of judgments that we're going to have to make in order to get the right kind of policy to do well as a society. We could imagine that AI could, in fact, explain to each of us in terms that we could understand highly complex, highly technical matters, and therefore could help supply the interface between expertise and the judgment of citizens. That's always been a difficult interface. I think AI could be a real facilitator of that, once again, if it's been correctly trained.
You know, there's another dimension on this, which I think could be broadly construed as civic education, but we don't have to get hung up on the terminology. I mean, democracy works best when there's a fair degree of transparency about, you know, what do the people actually believe. Right now, much decision making, often by elected representatives or unelected staffing, you know, members of the bureaucracy, are operating at best with some input from a poll, and often not even with that. I mean, if we truly knew on every substantive decision, how much does our world of citizens actually understand or believe in what's about to be decided? What does the data tell us about, you know, this bill will bring back jobs to America, or this bill will increase our productivity, or, you know, this bill will dramatically reduce inflation? I mean, imagine if we got to a point of collective intelligence that could literally be quality controlled and documented, yay or nay, in real time. It would radically make more transparent decision making, and I think have the potential to offset one of the things that everybody is fearing about AI. There'll be more and more, you know, robots and imitation, you know, Donald Trumps or Hunter Bidens and so on and so forth. And there is the chance to actually bring to bear, you know, real facts analytically presented in a non-biased way, if it is trained in the right way. And that could change a lot how democracy actually works.
So I want to ask you one more question. I have many more, and I may sneak in a few others, but since we have a lot coming in the chat, let me ask you one more for right now, which relates to what you've just talked about, and that is to imagine for us 5 years in the future, 10 years, 20 years in the future. You pick the time frame and tell us what it is. Obviously, more participatory institutions is something you've written about for a long time. You've talked about, both in this book and your past books, about the models, the historical models that should inspire us for creating more participatory institutions. And so I'm just very curious what your vision is. How do you imagine the future of institutions in the age of AI? Do we have a new era, potential era of Athenian democracy that replicates, whether it's the Athenian model or models that we've seen before, or something entirely different, and what that looks like? And does it help us to overcome some of the challenges of scale and diversity that have plagued us in realizing a more participatory vision up until now?
I mean, I think the question of technology allowing a more direct form of democracy and representative versus a representative model. I mean, I see Rosalind Fuller on the call here. She's written about that. Lean Lansmore. I mean, lots of people have been imagining democracy moving more and more in that direction. And one of the issues that we put in our book is the so-called challenge of scale, which is as democracies get bigger and bigger, they inevitably get more diverse and more complicated. And mastering that complexity is one of the very big challenges that a democracy has to do to keep going. Technology has the potential to manage that scale in a much better way, but it is a choice. We may decide, we don't really want to have it as direct as the Athenians had, and in many ways, some of our founding fathers had just that perspective in their earlier eras. So there's a human question about how much we want to or should make them more participatory. I think there will be increasing pressure to have that happen. I think one of the frustrations that many people feel today is that their representatives are out of touch, too far from them, not understanding, and of course, many of them are representing literally millions of people. How can you represent millions of people? So I think there'll be a lot of pressure and natural sort of gravitational pull towards much more direct participation. And then armed with AI is going to put an extra twist on that, because the nature of the participation may be segmented or it may be augmented in particular ways. So I think it's an unknown territory, but I think it's central to one of the questions that we will have to ask as our democracy evolves and as AI itself takes more and more root in how we work.
So you have a lot of fantastic questions coming in the chat. What we're going to do is ask you to read them. I will also help to moderate them, but to give you a chance to kind of see what's there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use this moment for a commercial announcement for everybody else. It'll give you a chance to read. We will ask Josh and Brook to answer your questions, and then we will, once we stop the live stream, then we'll open it up for you to raise your hand and ask more questions out loud for yourselves. So in the interim, while they are reading the questions, I'll just say that our next talk coming up next month will be on October 26th at 4 p.m., where we're going to talk again more squarely about AI and citizen engagement with two platform developers, Robert Bjornsson from Citizens Foundation in Iceland, and Colin McGill, the creator of Polis, and Ariel Prokacha, professor of computer science at Harvard University, who writes about mathematical techniques and the uses of AI for measuring more representative citizen engagement, and works with platform providers. So that will be a very practical conversation about technology and the way in which it is enlivening citizen engagement. So let me pause there. Have I given you enough chance to read and to moderate yourselves and see if there are some questions you want to start with?
Well, one of the questions is about scale, and it asks, is the kind of democracy we imagine work better at small scales? And Brook has already alluded to this, but I think it's important to underline it. Scale really is always the opportunity and the challenge for democracy. Scale, both the number of people who are engaged, who are motivated to work together as citizens, is essential if a democracy is going to deal with its potentially hostile external rivals. And diversity is also essential insofar as democracy does better than autocratic systems when it's able to make use of more diverse forms of knowledge, of information, of simply raw data. And when you have more types of experience, more types of basically background understanding of the world, more types of technical knowledge in the mix, then you're going to have the potential for a better solution to the problems that confront us. But scale also makes things more difficult. It makes it harder to come to the win-win or the positive sum negotiation that people recognize as being, in fact, better than being outside of the bargain. So when you have more diverse perspectives, interests, when you have more people that you have to manage, it becomes harder to make self-government real in people's lives. So it's a mixed bag. We can't stay really small. That's not an option, at least in the world of modern nation states. But we have to find ways to manage the diversity of interests. And that comes back to civic education. Basically, people have to understand that they're not going to get everything that they want, and that it is a matter of coming to a bargain that is the best available that will allow us to go on in our lives together. So yeah, small is in some ways easy, but it's not possible to maintain, and therefore we have to learn how to get big.
Brooke, want to pick one off the list?
Yeah, there was a interesting couple of questions essentially about, does AI make things better or worse for marginalized people or people who are not part of current elites in our society to participate? And again, I think this is another one of those double-edged swords. I can imagine all sorts of scenarios whereby AI can lift many more voices just through understanding and looking for patterns and tabulating large amounts of data and calling on literally millions of people, so that many people who are in the shadows in some sense of the word today, their voices are being heard. But that's going to depend on a design, because there is a negative scenario, which I'm sure many have already thought about, which is there is a level of skill and literacy and understanding about technology that will benefit those who already have resources and education to do that, versus many people who are underserved in our society who do not. And this could be another example of the rich getting richer. So again, we will have to manage it according to the values that we want to bring forward in designing the next generation of our democracy with these kinds of tools.
So
Josh, back to you. Yeah.
Yeah, just another question. Ross Fuller asks, can you really educate people in learning how to be good citizens? Don't people have to have the experience of being part of society? And so, democratic education, I think, certainly has to be at least partly experiential, but it also has to be in part knowledge-based. It's, I think, essential that we have some common understanding of the background institutions that we're using, of the history of how we got to those institutions, of what the alternatives are to democracy, about what democracy actually is at its core. And they have to have some background grasp of the skills that are necessary, the skills of communication, of listening to the other side, of being able to give up some of the things that you are clinging to in order to allow other people to have access to some of the things that they need. So yeah, the experience is necessary, but if we don't have any kind of background, can't teach people some basic things in terms of knowledge and skills, then their experience of politics may be entirely negative. They may simply go in and experience it as a cage fight, a zero-sum game. And in that case, the experience is simply going to be destructive to the possibility of continuing democracy.
Roz actually asked another interesting question, which again, I think is lurks in some of the other questions. Essentially, it's the question of virtue and righteousness, and that the bargain that we talk about seems kind of morally neutral. And on the other hand, is moral neutrality what we really need? Because people are sometimes now just getting too self-righteous about their political causes. And I think that one of the virtues, I think, of taking this model of the bargain is it gets us out of a lot of the religious wars that is based, the morality is often seen as perfection, right? My view of what has to happen about social justice, or my view of what has to happen about patriotism, or my view of what has to happen about inequality is absolutely, the pinnacle of goodness. And if you disagree with me, you disagree with God, or you disagree with goodness as I understand it, and thousands of others do as well. And that, unfortunately, is what's fueling a lot of our polarization now. It's not that having those kinds of views are bad, but we have to learn how to kind of get along with one another, even if we don't happen to agree with each other's secular religious beliefs. And I do think that we do have a sort of a series of religious-like wars. Sometimes it's literally religious wars, but more often it's religious-like wars. And I think the value of the bargain is that we can start to get to some kind of workable compromises, meaning not that one side is right and the other is completely wrong, but rather we've got an accommodation so that we can get along with one another and move forward. And again, I think that, AI can be helpful to us in understanding the contours of where are the true red lines, where are the breakpoints in terms of the nation as a whole. And that may be very helpful to us.
So there's another question. I'm just sort of taking them almost randomly at this point. Simon Hardy asks, how can we think that we can achieve a global democratic model when we see the difference between the US, Chinese, and EU models, for instance? Well, I tend to think that there's not going to be a global democracy. I don't think that it's plausible to imagine, at least I don't see how a world government could be, at this point, self-government by citizens. But I think we have to recognize that democracies always have been, and I tend to think are likely to continue to be, bounded communities. That is, communities that don't include everybody. And that's really one of the fundamental conditions that Brook and I talk about in the book, is that democracy has to define who is a citizen. And who is a citizen is never simply answered by everybody. There are always exclusions, and the exclusions are different in different cases. But I think that recognition that democracy is always going to be in a bounded community, and it will always be in tension with and in rivalry with non-democratic systems, like that of China, for example, and other examples we could come up with. I guess that's sort of the answer, is that democracy is one option for human self-organization, among others. It's not the only possible one. It's not necessarily going to be the one that is ever universalized. The question for every given society is, do you, the people who have defined yourselves as the citizens, want to rule yourself or are you going to be ruled by a boss? And if you are going to rule yourselves, how are you going to do that? What do you need to do that? And of course, what we say is you need to educate yourselves in the first instance.
Well, and just to build on that, another kind of truism that is often forgotten by particularly a younger generation today is that democracy is much harder to make work than a monarchy or an autocracy. And democracies are in the minority. They often fail. The default is always to have a strong person, usually a strong man, but it could be a strong woman too, but a strong person who controls a hierarchy. And most businesses are, hierarchical today because it is more efficient and faster. If you have a profit motive, you usually don't have the time and luxury to go through a democratic process. And that's just the way the world is. And unless we remember that we are in the minority, we people who believe in democracies, we're going to be deluded into thinking someday everybody around the globe can vote on whether or not we're going to stop driving SUVs or not. I just think it's an unrealistic assumption if you look at the true ecology of how people govern themselves all over the world, or get governed all over the world, I should say.
I will chime in here to it's a longer conversation, but I think it's been a sort of false North Star, if you will, that we have been misled by for a long time in the world of the web. So just a process point again, we're going to end the official streaming at 6 o'clock. So I want to ask you one last question, but I invite everybody to stick around and then you can just speak your questions for yourselves. If Josh and Brook are willing to stick around for a little while, which I think they are, and answer some more questions. But I just wanted to ask you for your final thoughts on this conversation on AI and democracy. I don't see a lot of it happening. And I'm wondering, as you go around the country and talk about this new book, whether you see any ways in which we can reinvigorate the conversation about how to reimagine our democracy. My sense is that since the last election, we've sort of let down our guard, and there has been a little less focus on the future of democracy. And so especially with this AI moment, I'm just wondering what you see as the potential for strengthening this conversation.
I'll just say, if you look at books that are getting published, conversations that people are having, at least in the media that I read, there are really two topics that people are obsessing about. One is, can democracy survive for the next couple of years at least, and maybe the long run? And the second is, what's going to happen with AI? Is it going to bring us into utopia, catastrophe, or something in between? So we've got these two really pressing questions. Obviously, there are other very pressing questions, climate change and so on, but these two are really pressing questions. It seems pretty obvious that they go together. And so it really, I think, is for us to, people on this chat and elsewhere, to simply insist that these must be together, that if AI is not democratically regulated, it will end up being our boss, or those who control it will end up being our boss. And if democracy doesn't learn to use AI well, then those who are autocrats in other societies will learn to use it well, and they will become our boss. So this is an absolutely key conversation that has to happen, and surely, given the urgency of both questions, it must.
Yeah.
Brook, last word to you.
Yeah, I would just add to Josh's point, and also just compliment you, Beth, for connecting dots between these, because I think the conversations are still relatively disconnected. I've been out talking about the book to some other audiences, and nobody's asking me anything about AI, with the possible exception of, so isn't social media, really a problem we have to fix. I think what makes it even more both frightening and exciting at the same time is that the AI question is not just going to be about, is voting going to be more direct? Are we going to have better experts to help us with decisions when we have to make policy? But there are all these secondary issues. For example, if AI destroys lots of jobs and it tilts the economy in a different direction, and it changes the nature of how capitalism operates, either to the worse or the better, that will have a ripple effect back into the society, which will continue to want or start to doubt self-governance. As Josh alluded, if we start to fall behind the race in AI technology against hostile powers, which are rising more and more every day, that has nothing about how we're going to vote. That has something to do literally about, will we survive against the invasion of a massive, AI automated force, the likes of which we have never seen, and we'll lose our independence forever. So there are lots of second and even third order questions about AI and what it will do to democracy, and not just how do we better make democracy work, that I think has to get folded into the question. And once we build the bridge, and we've started a little bit today, I think we can drive a lot more traffic than we had time for today.
So again, thank you very much. It was delightful to have both of you talking about the civic bargain. We put the details in the chat, but for those who are watching this after on the web, please visit Princeton University Press or your favorite local bookstore to purchase a civic bargain. At Princeton University Press, you can use Civic 30 to get a 30% off discount. And thank you to everybody for joining us. And for those who want to stick around for virtual wine and cheese, I invite you please just to raise your hand electronically, and then we can continue the conversation.